Hey, Year 10, welcome back. We'll pick up our discussion of still life around about halfway through the poem. As the group of people, we never get told who's in that group, but as the we, I'm thinking about that now. I sort of imagine the speaker, maybe one person and family members, um, a wife, a daughter, etc. At the same time, maybe the we could be broader than that, and it's trying to comment on this walk around the graveyard is metaphorical for what we're experiencing as a community or as a country. Anyway, we talked about the we sort of skirting the edge of the graveyard around the hawthorn hedge. And then from those quite sort of small and tight images, we start to move in the second half of the poem to these big images, starting with the astronaut. A few people picked up on this idea of the astronaut. One student talked about how this has connotations of adventure and exploration, whereas lots of the rest of the poem has this mood that we talked about before of sort of stillness and sadness. And so again, you've got this sense of juxtaposition. This astronaut is almost out of place. It is out of place. And maybe that out of placeness, another student suggested, emphasises how unusual everything seems at the moment, the unfamiliarity of our circumstances and the way that makes us uneasy, maybe makes us feel out of place ourselves. And I guess there's this idea that the astronaut keys into an idea that we feel far away, even where we're in a situation where we're actually stuck at home. Yeah, the astronaut is an image from out of this world, and we feel in some way out of our own lives. So I thought that was interesting. And the astronaut is in fact the grave digger. Hazmat is short for hazardous materials, so this protective suit that a key worker at the moment might have to wear. Not just a grave digger, of course. You will have read and heard a lot about protective equipment for all sorts of key workers, in particular doctors and nurses. Those sorts of people maybe come into our thinking a little bit when we think about that suit. One person also suggested that the extremity, that sort of extreme image, it looks like something from out of this world, from another planet, even though it's just another person doing a job within that community. That extreme image maybe says something about the extremity of social distancing. Maybe could even be seen as saying there's a sense in which we're overprotective. This suit is a symbol for how we're distanced from each other too far, and for that reason there is an exchange of stares. They don't exchange words or handshakes or anything else, just stares between the protagonist of the poem and the gravedigger. Interesting as well in this stanza how it's a hazmat suit and visor and mask and overshoes and white leather gloves. So we get these repeated ands to kind of emphasise all these layers of distance between people, which unavoidably exist at the current moment. Propped on his spade at an open grave. And even an open grave is quite interesting. Obviously it means this is a freshly dug, a newly dug grave, so a reminder of the sad reality of the situation that a larger than usual number of graves are being needed. But an open grave seems to me to have connotations almost of a war or a massacre. So again, you have that slightly uneasy thing on the edge of the poem. It's about one thing, but it carries almost a threat of something else, some bigger or more man-made disaster, as well as this kind of natural phenomenon that's going on at the moment. Okay, moving on into the final part of the poem, and the perspective shifts again. So we've got the sort of landscape and the barriers to the landscape in the first part. Then we've got this one individual working in the landscape. And now we sort of, as the astronaut has prepared us for, we kind of zoom out into the universe. this much bigger cosmic scale of things, um, which might make us imagine ourselves or imagine the protagonist as quite small in the big scheme of things. The universe, breathless and muggy tonight. And a few people commented on this stanza. You've got this idea of breathlessness as a symptom of COVID-19. So the whole universe is breathless, as we're all suffering. We might not have the disease, but we're all suffering physically or mentally at the time. So that student had the idea that the universe there was being used to emphasise the universality of this current experience. Another person suggested the semantic field of outer space, which continues in this stanza, having been introduced with the astronaut. Suggests everything is very unusual, everything's strange at the moment. We're out of our comfort zone, we're out of our usual orbit, if you like, to use another outer space word. And another student said that, which I thought was interesting. This stanza and the next one imply we cannot really trust the earth and we aren't safe anywhere. The whole universe is breathless. There's no place of safety. And the moon, moving on to the next stanza, is cold-blooded. And a separate student picked up on that. Cold-blooded is sometimes a synonym for heartlessness, for callousness. It's like he's blaming the moon, this student said, for recent events. Well, on one level that doesn't make sense. There's no sense in blaming the moon, but we can see how that would work symbolically. Think back to Bayonet Charge and the cold clockwork of the stars and nations. The stars there, we said, could sort of stand in for ideas of fate or ideas of providence, God. And maybe the moon's playing that role here. The universe is against us and no one's looking out for us. We might get that sense from this line. So these big images, comfortless images maybe, of the universe and the moon. And then we're talking about marooned villages. We've come across the word marooned before in the last couple of weeks, but it's quite a different effect here. Marooned villages under the hill. One student said they really like that line because it accurately shows how towns and villages and homes within those villages are all cut off from each other. We're all marooned. We're all, in a sense, on our own little islands at the moment. Another person said, under the hill, it's like the hill is above them casting a shadow, and that's quite threatening. But at the same time, this student said the shape of a hill in their mind's eye made them think of the shape of a coronavirus curve, those graphs that you sort of see on the television in terms of the number of cases and the number of deaths. And actually, being under the shadow of a hill, it might be a physical hill there, but there's also, we're walking under the shadow of this curve, which is casting a shadow over everybody's lives in various ways at the moment. And then we move into the final stanza. And of all the stanzas, this is probably the one that most people commented on. A stagnant dusk that parts to allow an ambulance free. It's only 10 words, but there seems to be an awful lot going on there. A stagnant dusk, a couple of people commented on the word stagnant, which shows that nothing is happening, but it also has negative connotations, an unhealthy nothingness. And then that nothingness sort of parts and divides, and you get this bold image of as one student called it, of the ambulance coming through a cloud of dust. And they said that gave them a spooky feeling, as well as this sense of intrigue. As we asked before, who is this ambulance for? What is this ambulance doing? It brings us back, another student said, to reality after the more otherworldly or dreamlike imagery of the early part of the poem. I think it is a dreamlike poem. There's this sense of floating and drifting about it. And then I'm inclined to agree with that student. This ambulance potentially might bring us up short, or might bring us back to a sense of reality. Another student said, the poem feels unfinished. The ambulance comes through and then it stops. We don't find out any more about this ambulance. The poem feels unfinished, the student wrote, like lockdown is unfinished and our future is uncertain. So I think the poem does reflect that sense of uncertainty, and here are some other emotions which people felt came across in the mood of the poem: alienation, slowness, sorrow, distance, unreality, isolation. Some of those we've discussed, and there's some quotes from students' messages as well on the screen there, just showing overall these negative ideas, this tense and restrained but definitely negative mood around the poem, which perhaps reflects some of the mood around our lives just at the moment. So I want to talk about that ending to finish off today's lesson, and the mood around it, that ambulance at the end of the poem. So we finish with this image of the ambulance, and as well as being a striking image, I think it's quite an ambiguous image, because yes, definitely it fits in with that negativity that some of those comments we just looked at show. An ambulance represents an emergency, it represents injury, the danger of death. But there's a positive side to it as well. An ambulance is something that brings help and assistance. So after this sort of drowsy sorrow of the poem, the ambulance arrives, someone's coming to the rescue. You can put that more sort of positive spin on it. And I like the way that the ambulance, as the student I've just referenced said, the poem's left there on ambulance. It's not filled in for us. We're not told whether to take that positively or negatively. It holds that uncertainty in the image. It keeps both of those meanings in tension at the same time. The ambulance at the end of the poem made me think of a poem, Ambulances by Philip Larkin. His picture's here on the screen, as well as another poem by Larkin, which is called Armitage. And the final image of that poem is a doctor going from house to house, but it's kind of a sinister image rather than a positive one. And that reminded me a bit about this ambulance here. It can be read in more than one way. And I think Armitage, I know, is a fan of Larkin's poetry, and there's every chance that he's consciously making that reference back. And then that made me think about the gravedigger in this poem. Well, the most famous gravedigger in literature is in Shakespeare. In the play Hamlet, two gravediggers speak to Hamlet, and Hamlet picks up a skull in this scene, and here Shakespeare's pictured with the skull, but Hamlet picks up the skull and reflects on mortality and life and death. I thought, well, the talkative gravediggers in Hamlet are quite different from the silent one here, but you can't help but be reminded. So there seems to me to be quite a bit of intertextuality going on in this poem. And I found that interesting because the poem is about something that's happening now, something unique. It's never happened before, certainly in our lifetimes. This current situation we're in, it's very of this moment, but it's still going back into these traditions of literature. And it actually goes back possibly into a further tradition. Because, as I said earlier, I looked up this idea about the hawthorn bush, or the hawthorn hedge. And hawthorns traditionally in England are actually, it turns out they're quite a symbolic plant, and they can be seen as symbolising love and protection and fertility, and they're linked in particular to this idea in this picture here of the green man. And the green man is a symbol, it's been a pagan and a Christian symbol of rebirth, of renewal, of the spring, if you like. The idea that things die and winter comes, but then in the spring things come back to life and things grow again. And the hawthorn, because it grows in spring, has been seen as symbolic of that idea that everything is going to be renewed, everything's going to come back. And I thought, well, how interesting, because here's this hawthorn hedge, which is a block, a barrier, and it's linked to these ideas of death or limitation, but also it holds within it this image of hope, this image of the green man, the fact that yes, there's death and there's sadness, but life is going to come again. And maybe that positive note is a nice note on which to end the lesson today. I hope you have a really good weekend, and I'll see you again next week.